involved in the New Park Initiative in South Africa, then advised the Rwanda program, and then was executive director of Sudan of the RFI, as it then became. And then it later on became Concordis. As you will see, Peter's the current chief executive of Concordis, which was one of the successor organizations. And as so we'll explain that too. Just to have one or two other announcements. I hope you've got the list of forthcoming events which are there from the 27th of May every month until October, just with a break for August. This will be a comparative approach to how we approach our track to, or how we'd like to position our track to approach, both with respect to Korea, the Korean Peninsula, which we've been working on. Michael Schluter has been leading that for some years, and I've been working with him, and also then on Ukraine. And there are similar issues coming up there, but that will be unfolded in those sessions. I also like to introduce to you Ruben Alacon. I have introduced him before some arrived. Ruben, you're operations manager for RPI as well as operations manager for Jubilee Center. You do the two things in tandem, and Ruben will be looking after the technical aspects of this meeting. And just to mention also that it's being recorded, so be aware that it will be on record, just for your own information. Are there any other announcements which I need to make? Ruben?
No, no.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll plunge straight in now. You'll have seen the previously in different contexts, I've introduced the approach of RPI, Relational Peacebuilding Initiatives, or as we developed it from our predecessor organizations, New York Park Initiative, and then RFI. And so I go back to this very brief, I'll rush through this very preliminary methodological introduction, because really the point of this meeting is much more to look at how the Sudan program itself worked out. So let us start. What is peace building? It works across the political divides. The aim is to sow seeds for peace, including all people and communities, within a just and workable framework for the future. In other words, finding common ground. It's not a mediation process, it's a facilitation, bringing people together and helping them to think about how that common future might work out. So it's in between the different elements across the political divides. It's future orientated, it's based on shared principles. Why peace building? On the one hand, we've got development, many development agencies working to build things and help people on the ground. But on the other hand, we have security and attempting to keep the peace or have peacekeeping operations in different parts of the world. But there's a missing link between the two. How does development translate into security? How does security ensure that it's got an underpinning of development? So really peace building holds the two things together. So in our approach, we have three different tracks which we identify, tracks 1, 2, and 3. And these are not mutually exclusive, and they reinforce one another. So track 1 is high-level facilitation among those in positions of top leadership, addressing the immediate steps required to put in place a peace settlement. These can often be secret processes, or else they can be very public indeed, as we saw in the notorious interface between Trump and Zelensky, with Vance calling the shots too at the same time. But there's a lot behind the scenes, and what happens behind the scenes is what cuts it in a track 1 process. On the other hand, there's track 3, Now, track 3 will have a more specific focus, which can be either a region or locality, or it can be focused across the country, but on a single issue. So it's really very focused and very targeted in a particular way. Track 2 is operating between the two at an intermediate level, middle range leaders looking at middle distance issues. It operates on a low profile, but not secret basis. And it draws together people who have access to the major players, the principals, as we call them, but are not themselves the flag carriers. Now, it can have two different functions. It can be a catalyst and consensus builder. So they're, first of all, they're catalysts, and then they're consensus builders. Let's see what each of those are. Catalysts: building background trust to resolve sticking points. That's a bit of an illustration there. Building trust away from the fears on either side. Consensus builders: developing a common framework for peace so that it can put the whole building in place. Oh dear, I've got relationships foundation, international process. So overlook this typo there. It's in touch with the principals, that's the major players. It's future focused and it's research based. The choice of participants is trusted by the principals, but they are not themselves the political flag bearers. And how you choose the participants. Firstly, the participants must, each of them, be rooted in the story and experience of a conflict. They need to be first-hand involvement. They need to have that first-hand involvement with the conflict involved. So they know the dynamics. They know the hopes and fears that are motivating people. On the other hand, they must be sufficiently able to reach out to those with opposing views. It's an interesting balance which has to be struck, and in judging who's best to be involved, both these sides of the story need to be taken into account. Now, we have the idea of relational thinking, which is something which many will be familiar with, the work of Michael Schluter, set out in The Relational Lens, for example, in Cambridge CUP 2016. And it's suggesting 5 relational principles, the R factor. So first of all, there is parity, that each must be mutually recognizable. You must recognize the other as those who have equal value to oneself. Secondly, directness. There needs to be quality communication, not it needs to be immediate rather than mediated by other things. There needs to be continuity over time. There needs to be a shared story. Multiplexity, there needs to be breadth of knowledge, that people need to be engaged in the round, and that the whole issue needs to be seen in all round terms. And then there needs to be commonality with shared goals, that they need to be able to build shared goals together. So look at these in turn: parity, participants attend and their personal capacities, and they're treated as equals. In other words, if they're members of the government or linked to the government, they are not there to really declare what the government's going to do, but rather to share their story and listen to the others. So that's parity. Then directness. There needs to be a face-to-face environment, face-to-face conversation in a safe environment, typically in a large house, for example, with grounds people can walk around in. They're not going to be harassed by the press outside. They can talk to one another, although, as I say, it's confidential rather than secret. And we have the Chatham House rule. In other words, what people say can be shared, but not who said it and in what context. Continuity, there needs to be increasing trust over time, so that you build the trust over a series of meetings, especially, and then multiplexity, understanding each other's political context and personal background. So there's a diversity of links and networking that goes on there, and commonality, that there can be shared objectives which are developed over time and built on. So you have the key elements of racial peace building, key people, safe and neutral venue, series of meetings, building consensus, and transmitted to the political leaders. Right. Any questions about that? That's a very rapid run through of the basic methodology, relational peace building. Does anybody have any questions at this stage? In very briefly, and which I can answer very briefly. Okay, so I'll dive now into the Sudan situation. Now, Sudan, we were involved in Sudan from 1999 onwards. I say we, being the organization which became Relationships Foundation International, having previously been New York Park Initiative. The Second Sudanese War was a conflict which took place in Sudan from 1983 to 2005. It's a continuation of the First Sudanese Civil War, the Nyanya, which began in 1955. The Second Civil War was a complex conflict with multiple causes, including ethnic, religious, and political tensions, and resulted in the deaths of an estimated 2 million people and the displacement of millions more. By 1999, it was still ongoing. It had intensified over the recent years, with both sides committing atrocities against civilians. And the Sudanese government, led by Omar al-Bashir, was accused of using scorched earth tactics against the rebel Sudan People's Liberation Army's SPLA. The SPLA, in turn, was accused of human rights abuses, including abduction of children. And the war had a devastating impact on the people of Sudan. Millions of people were displaced from their homes, and many were living in refugee camps in neighboring countries. The conflict also had a major impact on the economy of Sudan, which was already struggling. So we have the players there. The government of Sudan, GOS, General Omar al-Bashir, and his party was the National Congress Party, NCP. It had come out of the National Islamic Front, and there was this very controversial but very influential figure, Hassan al-Turabi, who eventually set up his own party, the Popular Congress Party, but they together were the complex of parties who constituted the government of Sudan in different ways. On the other hand, you had other northern parties, the Umar Party, Sadiq al-Mahdi. The Ahmadi was the descendant of the Mahdi who fought against General Gordon. Of course, there's a famous incident of Gordon being killed on the steps of what now is the presidential palace. They're based largely in the West. The Muslim Brotherhood had a presence, other Islamic groups as well. Then the southern parties, the SPLM or A, depending on whether you talk about the SPL, the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement or Army, led by Colonel John Garang. And then there was the breakaway faction led by Riek Machar, had broken away from the main SPLM. There was a certain ethnic basis to this, although that was rather played upon, with the SPLM being more drawn from the Dinka and the SPLM in being drawn from the Nuer. But that one must be careful about how one characterizes that. I'm sure Peter will have some views on that too. Other regional parties, Darfur Region, Justice and Equality Movement, and the SPLM-A. Now, these were in the western area, which became, of course, notorious for the terrible drought which was there, and the fighting which took place and the killings which pertained, and the effects of that exist in Sudan today, I fear, which has torn the country apart, but that's another story. There were the parties from the Eastern Beja region, the Beja Congress, the parties from the Nuba Mountains, the Blue Nile regions, the Nubian interests. Now, be clear, you must distinguish between Nuba Mountains, which were in the center of Sudan, and the Nubians, who are from the north. Nubians are very close to Egypt, and in fact, there's a close cultural overlap there. And then the Democratic Party, the DUP, led by Maulana Muhammad Osman al-Mirghani, which was a sort of umbrella movement, trying to bring all the regional parties together as a single grouping, with varying success. So we had then, in order to try and address the war, we had a track what in terms of what I've been saying, the track one process. And this was the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, established in 1966 as a regional organization. The IGAD consisted of all the different regional, the countries in the region, Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and so on, as well as Sudan. But the peace process, which IGAD was trying to foster, was focused very much led by Kenya. So there we had the launching of the peace process, supported by the UK and Norway at that stage, as well as regional actors, especially Kenya. Moving forward, so this was the principles which the IGAD was trying to get both sides, the North and the South, to follow. Now, the IGAD process was a bilateral process between the government of Sudan and the major grouping of the SPLM, which I've mentioned, are led by Colonel John Garang. And the 5 principles which it was trying to foster and get the sides to agree on were: 1, self-determination for South Sudan; 2, wealth and power sharing, especially with respect to oil; security arrangements, humanitarian access and relief; and then abjuration of violence. Now, IGAD had made some progress, but it soon stalled because of the deep-seated mistrust between and within the conflicting parties. Because not only was there deep distrust between the government and the SPLM, but within the Sudanese People's Movement, there was, of course, the fracture with the faction led by Riek Machar, who played this off, and they're playing off, which the government was able to play off one against the other. There were huge divisions in the north, between the central parties, and indeed Umma, etc., as well. So all these, there's sort of a roundabout of a merry-go-round of political jockeying, which never really seemed to stop. Then there were multiple actors, underlying issues. All these different factors came into play, and there was a lack of inclusivity in the IGAD process because it was bilateral between the government and the Southern Movement, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the major faction. So it stalled. And the Americans, I have to say, didn't help, because had a hardline stance against the government of Sudan. There were allegations that the government of Sudan was harboring terrorism. This was, of course, before 9/11, but there was a lot of anxiety about this, which of course led to that horrible event. The Assistant Secretary of State, Susan Rice, was an expert in the imposition of sanctions. She was the one who saw sanctions as her specific area of expertise, and the key lever for the US policy to impose itself on other countries, especially in order to promote human rights, etc. And then that put the US at odds with the IGAD process, because the IGAD was trying to build agreement. The US was pushing huge pressure on the GOS and undermining that attempt to do so. So things that didn't help either. Now, the meantime, the Relationships Foundation International, as it was then the New York Park Initiative, was approached by a gentleman called Aldo Adjo Deng, a former deputy speaker of the Sudanese parliament. And he said that the formal peace process has stalled, the IGAD process has stalled, and that an independent facilitator might help to unblock the process. So through various contacts, especially Robin Schroyer of the Hugh Pilkington Trust, we were brought on board to address this. At the same time, we developed a partnership with the African Renaissance Institute. Now, President Thabo Mbeki, the second president of South Africa as in a democratic form, had the idea of Africa, of a renaissance of African culture and international policy. And he brought on board Professor Washington Okumu, who had played a key role in brokering the final South African elections, bringing the Inkatha Freedom Party on board. Now, that's another story, which we'd be interested to hear about. But he had that kudos, as it were, with the South African government, and so was brought into that institute. And he was also, of course, the previous executive director of the New Park Initiative, and indeed it was through that he had done his work in South Africa. So we had, but now Professor Okumu brought to the table his high-level links, not just with South African, but across the whole range of Africa. And he had high-level links with the leadership of the SPLM, especially Colonel John Garang, whom we met in November 1999. So in tandem or at much the same time as NPI, or as it became RFI, was brought in, he was making these contacts. And so we were able to work and link up with Professor Okumu, who brought, as it were, this important link into the process, enabling the link in to the southern parties. We also employed Dr. Edward Christoph, who had a doctorate in international relations, looking specifically at the Horn of Africa, so he had a great expertise. But much of the groundwork was done by Sophie Bishop, as she was then, or later Johns, who set it up and did the preliminary ground exploration for the process. And then also Stephen Stordy, who had been involved with the Rwanda program, who became our finance and fundraising director. And I was brought in as executive director, having the experience of the South Africa process and also advising on the Rwanda program, which we did from 1994 to 1999. Now, we had then the IGAD process being stalled. We had RPI being brought up on the scene and starting our conferences. And then we have the election of George W. Bush in 2000. And the key member of this was Walter Kansteiner, who became the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa under Colin Powell. And this changed the story because, as we'll see, instead of then the three international players, the UK, Norway, and US operating at variance with one another, they were now able to work in tandem with one another. And that made a huge difference from the international point of view. So that was the Troika. But we were able to build on this link with Walter Kansteiner, who'd been a member of our NPI process on South Africa when he was working with the previous Bush administration. That's Bush Senior administration, George Herbert Walker Bush. Walter was then the Africa director for the National Security Council, but also worked in the think tank inside the State Department. So he had that link previously. And now being Assistant Secretary of State, in other words, responsible for the whole of Africa for the US foreign policy, he was now able to bring that to bear as well. I wrote to him in June 2001, and to cut a long story short, we got funding from the State Department. We had got some other funding previously through the Hewlett Foundation, and then before that through very helpful donors, starting with the Pilkington Trust itself, and then the Hewlett Foundation. But the State Department was able to give us the sort of funding which really got our process well underway. So they were working at the high level, in other words, at track one, the three countries working together, but then Kenya providing the chairmanship for the process in Machakos, under the chair of the General Lazarus Simbweyu, a Kenyan. And from that, and that ended in the Machakos Accord. But while that was going on, we had the RFI process. Now, the Machakos process was, as was IGAD, overall a bilateral process, as I've mentioned. The RFI had always drawn on all the different regions and all the different parties. So we weren't constrained by that very close focus on just the relationship between the government of Sudan and the SPLM. And that really helped to broaden the process and helped us to cover a range of other issues which needed to be addressed in order to draw everybody in. And also, it was not a negotiation. It was the creation of a safe space where people were able to talk to one another, listen to the issues, and have them carefully unpacked and presented, and then with great reflection and respect for one another, discuss how what the implications were for the future. We had a whole series of consultations starting in January 2001. It took taking place in South Africa, then UK, July 2001, UK, January 2001, and then in UK in July 2002. And then after the Machakos Protocol, the ISCOP, the Inter-Sudanese Conference on Peace, which took place in Ethiopia in 2003. And the consultations covered a range of different things, looking at the different constitutional frameworks, water and agriculture, federalism, self-determination, oil and gas sector, religion and the state, transitional arrangements, mineral resources, military and security issues, internally displaced persons and refugees, and peace and justice. So we covered the whole gamut of different issues which needed to be addressed and talked through carefully and respectfully in order to build a sound foundation for the future. So then we had the Machakos Protocol of July 2002, which took up actually the key elements of the IGAD principles, right to self-determination for Southern Sudan, the agreement on wealth sharing and power sharing, framework for ceasefire. And that in turn led to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in January 2005, but after Machakos, the negotiations had moved to Naivasha in Kenya, and there were a whole series of protocols addressing critical issues. And then you had the Comprehensive Peace Agreement signed on the 9th of January 2005, taking up the different protocols which had been agreed during the Naivasha process. And these were a 6-year interim power sharing arrangement. So that would be an interim arrangement until 2011. Wealth sharing, especially with regard to the oil revenues. Of course, that was a real bone of contention. The integration of forces, the integration of military forces. Now this, as you'll see, became quite an issue. And then in 2011, the South Sudan referendum on independence, which was eventually to result in the breakaway of the South, the peaceful separation of the South from the North, and as well as protocols for some of the border regions, Abyei, Southern Kordofan, and the Blue Nile states. So that was the CPA of 2005. But there was unfinished business. There was a border demarcation that was unclear. Areas like Abyei, South and Kordofan and Blue Nile were not really properly demarcated. There wasn't a proper implementation of wealth sharing. That remained quite a thorny question. But the killer factor, the killer failure, I have to say, was the problem of our security arrangements and defense structure, because in both the south and the north, that has proved to be fatal in many ways. The South never properly integrated the forces of the two factions, and they became sources of great conflict and fear of impending another one. And in the North, the militia, the very sectarian militia based in Darfur, the Janjaweed, became the rapid support forces, and those have been in conflict with the army, I fear, in the last few years, and that has caused enormous devastation in the country. So there was unfinished business, I fear, from the CPA. But having said all that, the horrific civil war did end, both by armistice in 2002 and then as a peace agreement in 2005. So that is something for which we can give thanks. Now, RFI led to two successful organizations. Now, Peter Marsden is here, who's the chief CEO of Concordus. And the other successful organization of more recent date is Racial Peacebuilding Initiatives. Now, briefly, and this is, I don't know if Peter will necessarily agree with my characterization of our two organizations, but I see Concordus as essentially a track 3 organization looking and it had the Darfur consultations in September 2004 and 2005, the Eastern Sudan, the Beja consultations in February 2005, Abyei in the south working from 2014, I understand, working closely with the Mezeria, Ngok, Dinka and the Dinka and its newer communities on the border there with South Sudan. And then also working with Kenya, Ivory Coast, Mauritania, Central Africa Republic, as well as, I think, Israel, Palestine work done there too. So Concordus worked very much at, as I say, at a track 3 level, in other words, focused on specific regions, specific issues. RPI is a more recent development, Relational Peacebuilding Initiatives, working from 2014 in different ways, initially with Concordus on Ukraine from 2014 in Donbass, and then focused on Donbass, and then now more recently looking at the deeper Dnieper as the focus for what we call the mutual convergent development process. But there's been also the Korea Peninsula Initiative, which ran concurrently from 2014 and focusing on the agricultural questions, the way to bring people together, building up what we call a mutual convergent development process, step by step. Now, both of these, and I think there's an interesting corollary between the two, because both the Korean Peninsula and and potentially now Ukraine have been armistice situations. The Korean Peninsula has had an armistice since 1953. The division of the peninsula. Ukraine is staggering towards, I have to say, an armistice between the Russian occupied and the Ukrainian held areas. But the same issues will come up, and what we're suggesting for both is this mutual convergent development process on track 2 lines. In other words, trying to build confidence across the divides and using a whole series of building blocks to build peace in both contexts. But this will be unpacked in our series of webinars, which I mentioned, from the 27th of May to 25. But I will stop there and then open it to wider discussion. And I think, Peter, you might like to come in as well at this stage too, to just say a few more words about Concordis.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, and really great to be here, and really great to listen to that. In fact, there are a few new things for me as well, which was fantastic. And I suppose my very briefly, I'm not going to steal your thunder because this is really about what the legacy that's going on here, and then of course the amazing ongoing work with RPI in Korea and Ukraine. But I guess the couple of bits I would say is one is that we as Concordis we've sort of been our own thing since 2004, but draw very, very strongly and heavily on the relational thinking and some of the thinking and learning and writings of Michael Schluter, and the experience that Jeremy and the experience that Jeremy's been presenting. And so we draw on that, and goodness, we wouldn't be any good at relational peace building if we couldn't maintain those relationships. And so I'll give credit to those relationships and the thinking that's gone into this. And as I lead Concordis, it's my honor and privilege to lead Concordis, very strongly have that sense of standing on the shoulders of giants there. So that's one part. Something I'd love to say, Jeremy, if I'm keeping eye contact with you, so you can draw a line over your throat when it's time for me to shush. But one thing I'd love to say is, when we look at, say, Sudan, and Jeremy, you've given this amazing sort of presentation on the work that was done, and that amazing work trying to stop the Sudanese civil war and really contributing to finding a workable solution. And of course, the straw man in the room is that someone's saying, well, you obviously didn't do that terribly well, because you might have noticed that South Sudan then went into a civil war, and life is actually quite difficult in South Sudan now. And of course, right now, Sudan is experiencing civil war as well. But I would say some extraordinary stuff is going on. One piece is, when there are well, in fact, there's an old African proverb, a saying, which says, when the elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. And of course, there's a lot of truth in that. When the big beasts come to fight, it's all of the little people that get squashed underfoot. But one of the things that we are seeing is that sometimes when the elephants fight, the small people actually hold their own. They actually have that resilience to conflict. And sometimes when the big beasts say, hey, actually, would you like to fight for us? Would you, those people who you don't like very much, those people with whom you've had some historic enmity, those people that we've had some interethnic cleavages. Maybe actually they're the people who are responsible for all of your woes now. And maybe if you were to turn on them or even kill them, then actually perhaps your problems will be over. And you can name any group over history that has been blamed for the world's woes, particularly by those rather more despotic. And what's really interesting is when we see communities stand up and say, no, I've been living cheek by jowl with these people for quite a long time. Maybe I trade with them. Maybe actually my business and their business is economically linked, very much like the approach, sort of macro approach that Jeremy, you've just been talking about, looking at mutual development and mutual development in the Donbass region or in the Dnieper River area. Actually, let's see where there are some economic linkages. And actually people say, do you know what? I'm not going to kill those people. I'm not going to go to war with those people, because actually I'm in quite a good trading relationship with them. And then secondly, what we're seeing in Sudan, and I'll draw to a close, I think, because then I'll let others come in. But what we're seeing in Sudan just now is that people are choosing to defy the government and stand up and say, neither of you are feeding us. both of you are using hunger as weapons of war. And we realize that if we don't find some kind of common cause, some common agreement, we and our families will starve to death. And in 2023, the harvest failed. In 2024, the Concordis teams, very much building on this relational thinking, went out into the communities, went out and worked with this network of local peace builders who are interestingly often quite powerful. They're often the emir or the chef, the traditional leader, perhaps even a king, and worked with them and said, how are we going to make sure we get crops in the ground, keep those crops safe till harvest, and make sure we've got a third of the crops to eat, a third of the crops to hide in the ground, cache in the ground for next year's sowing, and a third to market. How are we going to make sure we get our food out to market between where it's grown and where people are really hungry? And the punchline to the story is that working at it's not really a very sort of low level grassroots thing. It's actually working with some of the traditional leaders, some of the local authorities, and standing up to some of those big beasts and saying, do you know what, we're actually going to grow our own food. We need to be autonomous. We're not going to look to the aid community. We're not going to look to you to feed us. We're not going to send our sons to fight for you either. We're actually going to send our sons into the field to grow food, to move cattle, and make sure we've got something to eat. And slowly, some of those power dynamics have changed. And that's pretty exciting. So actually people in South Darfur have had food this year, even though there's famine across much of Sudan.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's great. Any other people who'd like to make comments, please? Any thoughts, any reflections of any kind? Richard, you were in Sudan, you say. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I was in South Sudan.
In South,
yes. Juba.
Yeah, Juba.
Yeah. I mean, I limited relationship now, but I mean, just as a sort of question of Peter's been saying what Concordis is doing, but is RPI involved in South Sudan or Sudan now?
No, I have to say we're not. At the moment, our focus is on those two areas, Korea and Ukraine, I have to say, and still very much at a exploratory stage, you could say. We produced a book on Korea, Mutual Convergent Development, called No Other Way to Peace in Korea, and we've been working on a similar body of work for Ukraine, very much along parallel lines to that. Now, it does strike me, looking at the whole Sudanese and South Sudanese situations, that a lot of the stuff which we were working on is very relevant, very painfully relevant now, I have to say. Peter's talked about agriculture and food security, but I think the issue for me, which stands out, is the issue of defense structure. Because as I mentioned, Sudan, there was a Khartoum Spring, you could say, not long ago, and all the things that we seem to be working for seem to be coming to fruition. I mean, Omar Bashir stepped down. There seemed to be the unfolding of some sort of democratic process coming into play. But then there was this horrible fallout between the Rapid Support Forces and the army, which devastated the country. I think they've blown huge sections of the country up, in their using artillery, bombs, etc. I mean, it's this heavy duty stuff which they've been throwing at each other and destroying the country in the process. Now, there were issues of how the defense structure could have been worked through, I think, which which is still unfinished business, I have to say, and which we need to come back to. And similarly, I think in South Sudan, because of the highly factionalized nature of the army, over the different factions within the army, which seem to be unresolved, and that the way that they struggle to find a single defense structure, which has had terrible consequences and now I fear, I'm not that close to the South Sudanese situation at the moment, but what I hear is that it's about to explode again, and it's just horrific. But there are these issues which we need to take into account. The structural questions: what is a defense structure which, for the benefit of all, for the security of all, look like? For example, which could have been and might still be hopefully addressed in both North or Sudan proper and South Sudan, for example. That's one of those areas, and there are others as well. Of course, the whole issue of state and religion, the structure of the constitution. Do you want a more federal structure, or do you want a more unitary one, etc.? Those are still unresolved issues in both of those countries. Any other thoughts? Any other comments?
In the beginning of May, I'm going to Rwanda with Tier Fund, and Michael has just sent me the chapter in his book that deals with that, because we're going to look at the amazing effects of the agricultural techniques that have been taught and lifting rural communities out of poverty. They wanted us to see it for ourselves, having donated over the years. But it was fascinating to read Michael's chapter on how very much RPI were engaged really in the agricultural.
Yes.
And that brought a measure of peace.
Yes, I think RPI's or NPI's work, because it was still NPI in those days, I think it had two prongs eventually. It had a whole series of areas addressed, but the two key areas which eventually became the key contributions were, yes, the area of agriculture, because that had brought about the explosion, you could say, of Rwanda, because of the pressure on the land and the productivity of the land and the need for that to be addressed. And the other one was the issue of the post-genocide justice situation, because of the huge numbers of people in prison, and they because they were obviously implicated in some way in the genocide, and yet not being able to deal with that. So, and then introducing the whole idea of the gacaca, the local justice processes, which helped to relieve that situation. So NPI made a helpful contribution there. But I think the difficulty with Rwanda was that Rwanda is not an isolated situation, as we know only too well, even today, as we see what's going on in East Congo with the M23, which is a Tutsi-led organization, a Tutsi-led army. And so the whole Tutsi-Hutu conflict, or rather the conflict between certain Tutsi extremists and Hutu extremists and a large number of moderates caught in the middle, has been a continuing problem. Any other thoughts? Any other contributions? Well, we said we'd have an hour, and we're almost at the end of our hour. Ruben, do you want to say anything?
I really have nothing else to add. If you like the PowerPoint or the paperwork that Jeremy has provided for us today, please let me know, and I'll send it to you.
I've got the yes, please do ask for it. I've got the handouts there, which you can have. You're welcome to have.
Yeah. Just message me, and I can send those to you.
So yeah, so if you could contact Ruben. Now, how you want to be contacted, Ruben?
Just through my email address.
Through your email address, which is the Jubilee Center one.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Or mine, alternatively, I'm j.ive@relationalpeacebuilding.org.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and we hope we found this helpful and interesting. And I again advertise what we're going to be doing over the next few months from May onwards, the end of May, and unpacking what we call a mutual convergent development process and its implications for both career and what we hope will be a post-ceasefire situation in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you so much. Really, really interesting.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Well, so we'll sign off at this stage. Yes, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So Ruben, I think we can sign off then, and do keep in touch.
Right.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Well, thank you all.